Welcome to Best of Reddit. Be sure to subscribe as we upload new content daily. I'm not sure if this is a pro-revenge story because what I did was not an act motivated out of vengeance but instead anger, and nevertheless I did something to a place I hated that cascaded into a pro-revenge type result. As an adult I would say that what I and my father did was out of vengeance. With that disclaimer, let's start the story, shall we? So it was the summer of '95 when my parents signed me up to go to an all-boys summer camp. It was done out of necessity because my parents did not have the money for a babysitter, and day camp was a good way to keep me supervised. The venue, Camp Tamarack. It was a Boy Scout of America camp, but the program was not run by them. I cannot remember who had paid for the summer camp to be sublet. A bus would pick us up around 7 a.m. and we would make a trek through a series of towns, picking kids and young teenagers up on the way. The kids, some of them would not be the type you would want around you. Switchblades and butterfly knives were openly shown on the bus and evaluated by the other kids. Even at that age I asked myself, what kind of kid owns and carries around a weapon like that? I sat in the back of the bus and kept my head down. Anyway, let's cut to the camp itself. Every day we would be served breakfast. We would receive a box of milk and a turkey or bologna sandwich. I began avoiding eating anything because there was always some sort of mold growing on the bread. After that we had arts and crafts. Making necklaces out of beads and string, or those bracelets made out of that plastic twine that you looped in and out. I called it the sweat house activity because the teenage counselors who were watching over us would demand they be made faster and faster. The next activity was either archery or the gun range. I loved archery, but instead of using a natural material like feathers they used a sharp, thin plastic that would cut the space in between the index and middle finger. To this day I still have a visual scar from the amount of times it would slice my skin. I'm not the biggest fan of archery anymore, though I still would love to properly learn how to use a longbow. After that we would have lunch. Either you got an undercooked, cold, piece of pizza, remember the ones you could purchase that you could separate into rectangles? Those are the ones I'm talking about, a box of milk or orange juice, or another sandwich. I would opt for the pizza until I complained enough for my parents to give me a bagged lunches. In the afternoon we would always go swimming in the lake. If you were new to swimming they had portioned a section on the left side of the dock so the water would go up to your ankles. I went in there once and the sharp rocks lining the bottom cut my feet. If you had taken a beginner's course before then you would be allowed to be in the portioned off section on the right side of the dock. The water would go up to your waist. If you had already passed both or could prove that you had taken both beginner and intermediate training, which I had, then you were allowed in the rest of the lake. There were no lifeguards and we would be watched over by one counselor. The last activity would either be a trek around the lake or the recreation building. Depending on what group you were in you would do one of those activities on a 1-week alternative rotation. So for 1 week archery would be exchanged for using a BB gun rifle and the recreation center would be replaced by the trek around the large lake. Now let me explain why no one was ever safe on any given day. I'll start with the walks. One time I was on one, I stepped on a mound of dirt. I immediately began to sink in and panicked. The group continued to walk as I sunk lower. A friend of mine had swung around when they didn't see me and got the counselor's attention. They pulled me out just as my knees were submerged. I was frightened and I came home without shoes that day. The BB gun range had roughly 10 lanes, but instead of shooting the targets the psychopathic kids would shoot the other kids. No one ever stopped them and I got pelted a number of times. The rec room was a small gym. We were given half-inflated basketballs and footballs. The only balls we had that were usable for dodgeball were baseballs. Let that sink in. We were throwing baseballs at each other. Even going to the bathroom was a hazard since the brick ceiling had caved in on the right-hand side, and any time we needed to use the facilities it was more typical to hold it in or go in the woods. I don't ever remember going into that bathroom during the entirety of my stay. It was common to see other children who had soiled their pants as a result. I saved the best for last, the swim time. No one necessarily had to swim and you could hang out at a makeshift dock. One day a kid in my group, around 8, was playing on his Game Boy. This kid was very passive and did everything to avoid confrontation. He only ever spoke openly with a few of us. 15 minutes or so and a 12-year-old kid approaches him and demands the kid's Game Boy. The kid said nothing and craned his neck and head towards the ground. Not a good idea at that camp. The older boy found a large rock and threw it, point blank range, into his head. I vividly remember the crack I heard and the blood that stained the rock. The young kid blacked out, blood oozing from his skull, while the older kid grabbed the Game Boy and walked away. I knew enough to grab a towel, press it tightly on the wound, and yelled to the other kids to get the counselor immediately. An ambulance was called and he was brought to the hospital. Oddly enough, the kid came back the next week. He showed off where they had shaved a portion of his head and the 18 stitches he needed. Every day I begged my parents to not make me go back. I told them what I'm telling you, and my mom brushed it off as overreacting and wanting attention. That was until they visited it themselves. The camp held an event so the parents could see the campgrounds and were provided a late afternoon tour. The next day my dad told me that I wasn't going back and that my older cousin would be babysitting me for the rest of the summer. I was so elated that I was out of that psychotic hellhole they called a camp. The Revenge. I've always enjoyed writing. I was a bookworm in my younger days, and so I would use my dad's old Macintosh computer to write my own. My dad asked me if I wanted to write a letter about what I saw while I was there. I said, sure, and wrote a 2-page letter outlining everything that I've told you. My dad printed it and I didn't think anything more about it. One day during the last 2 weeks of summer, my dad urged me to write a second letter and to be very careful with my words. I didn't fully understand, but I wrote it using much more mature words. I used a dictionary and a thesaurus to write it out. I enjoyed writing the letters as it allowed me an outlet to explain my anger and disgust. What I was not made aware of was that my father had me write the first letter to the Boy Scouts of America. They sent a response saying that there was no proof and they were not liable for anything that happened on the grounds. The second letter, as well as the response letter, was sent to the state governor and the county newspaper. A few weeks passed and my dad handed me a portion of the paper. They had printed my letter as well as sending someone to write an exposé on the camp itself. At first I thought it was frightening and asked if I was in trouble, but my dad told me that I did a good job. This then led to the state investigation that resulted in the EPA learning that the camp was allowing companies to dump toxic waste in the water and on various parts of the grounds. The camp was immediately closed and never reopened. To this day, if anyone tries to get to the camp, there is a gate blocking the road leading down into the facilities. Instead, one would have to go to a different camp on the opposite side of the lake and then walk about 2 or 3 miles to see the remains of what used to be Camp Tamarack.